Hi folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network. Still a little bit of a husky voice from last weekend's Tony Robbins event, but otherwise going strong. I'm back in Sydney again this week, I guess for a personal course that I'm doing in public speaking, and I guess sitting on the rooftop of I guess a gorgeous boutique hotel in the Rocks here. And so what I thought I'd do before going into our Sunday session is have a look around at my surroundings. So this is, I guess, the guided tour of my little boutique rooftop garden. So there you go, the Tree of Life. We've got sitting behind me, I guess there's the city itself. And if I'm very creative, and if I'm, I guess, quite looking for danger, let's just say, I can lean out all the way over the edge and there's the Harbour Bridge. So not a bad spot. I'll do that again. Whee! So I'm going to make myself comfy. Gorgeous spot to spend the afternoon, and as with any Sunday session, well, hope you didn't get dizzy there, folks. As with any Sunday session, I'm going to be sitting here in a rooftop garden. You can't go past having a beer in your hand. So that is what I'm going to be doing today. So I can see a couple of people already jumped on. So I can see Barb and Luke. Luke said g'day. Hi folks, how are you going? Sunday session topic for today is site assessment due diligence. So we're going to be going through some of the things that you want to make sure that you are absolutely checking every single time that you're, I guess, doing a site assessment. Now, before I go into that, a little bit of logistics in and around the grounds. So our next meetup event is this weekend, so not the weekend that we're actually in, obviously, but next weekend, which is the 5th of October. That's down in Melbourne. Tony Meredith's actually going to be running that event on my behalf, given that it's actually my daughter's 18th birthday, so I'm going to be a responsible adult and chaperone her, I guess, coming into, I guess, blossoming into womanhood. So, and I'm very proud of my daughter, and she does come on from time to time and watch and like. So, hello, my darling, love you very much, and so proud of who you are and what you have become. That said, let's get on with the show. I guess today we're talking about site assessment due diligence. Now, the site assessment that you're going to do is going to be deal specific. So that's, I guess, obvious to many folks, but it's over and above if you're doing subdivisions, if you're doing townhouses, if you're doing units. The site assessment that you're going to be doing is slightly different for each and every one. But so what I'm going to do here is try and cover some commonalities that sit across all of them, and some of the ones that may not appear obvious to most. And I guess when we go through them, I'll try to explain how and why that might actually be the case. So, I'll talk to one in particular, which is a fire hydrant. So, what you want to be looking for is to see how close you actually are to a fire hydrant on your property, depending upon the strategy that you are doing. So, if you're doing units or townhouses, it's actually a compulsory requirement that you can actually service from a fire perspective the ability to actually put the fire out. So, how close you are, the proximity to a fire hydrant is actually critically important. Equally, if you're doing subdivisions, that's also going to be important, but to a lesser degree. And when you're doing that, not only do you need to find out where the fire hydrant is, but also you may need to actually determine what the pressure of the water is in that instance as well. Especially if you're going to be servicing units where you have to push water up, I guess, into the higher floors, you may have to do a pressure test of the water in and around that area. Now, if you're looking for a fire hydrant, one of the things that may not be obvious to most is when you drive along the road, there's a thing that reflects back under your headlights, and it's called a cat's eye. And fire hydrants are identified by a blue cat's eye, which sits in the middle of the road, and then there's typically a little yellow arrow just in the shape of a triangle, and it points to the footpath where the fire hydrant is. So it's not like America, where we've got these giant fire hydrants that dogs love, I guess, paying attention to, but for us, our fire hydrants actually typically in a tiny little manhole in the ground, and so these cat's eyes indicate how and where they are. So you should be looking for one of those. Now, if it's too far away, you may have to add one to your development. and if it's too close, you may have to actually relocate that. And I'm actually in a project right now where it is physically too close. And how is it too close, you might say? Well, it's right in the middle of the driveway that I want to be installing, and so you're not allowed to have, I guess, trafficable movement over the manhole, so we need to actually relocate that fire hydrant to a different location, which is an interesting challenge to do. I guess it's just something that you identify up front and cost out in the process. The next one that many people miss in the process is how and where your electricity is. Now, this may not seem that big a deal because electricity is running past your front doorstep almost everywhere you go. But what becomes critical is how and where the property pole is going to be located for your power, if you have above overhead power, or how and what you're going to do with regards to underground power, which is different for every single state, every single jurisdiction, every single council has different rules as to what you are and aren't allowed to do. Now, I guess where you've got a power pole, I guess on your side of the street, it can actually be quite challenging because the proximity of that power pole may be so that when you run your guy wire, I guess between that power pole and your property, if it crosses somebody else's boundary, that's typically an issue for the local energy provider because they don't want you crossing anybody else's property. So you need to find ways to actually get that electricity to not cross the boundary, which may mean that you need to add some underground services or something along those lines in order to do that. So it could change a $1,000 property pole into a $5,000 or $10,000 underground service, depending upon, I guess, how and where you're going to do that. Now that becomes really challenging in the fact that in many instances you've got a legacy house which may have been connected to a power pole for many years, and that tether connecting to the power pole may have actually been crossing somebody else's boundary for an eon. But what will happen is your energy provider will say, well, now that you're going through this subdivision process, it's actually your responsibility to clean that up right now. So don't assume that just because electricity is being provided to a house in a particular way right now, that is actually going to be how the energy provider will want that moving forward. So when you do that, one of the things that I highly engage is that you actually engage an electrical consultant who's endorsed with the local energy provider. Now, normally there's a wholesale provider and there's also a retail provider. So the wholesale provider is the person who sells the electricity to the retailer. So depending upon where you are, I guess those wholesalers are different, but then people like AGL, Energex, Origin, those sorts of things, they then resell that onto other people and actually put a little markup on the process. So you don't want the reseller consultant, you actually want, I guess, the wholesaler endorsed consultant. And what they can do is actually have a look at your property and determine whether or not the existing service can actually be connected very easily, and if that can't be done very easily, what it will actually cost in order to do that. Now, that becomes a little challenging when you actually go to the point of if you're doing a Battleaxe block, for example, because if you're going to be traversing to the rear of the property, now the only access that you've actually got is down the access handle, the driveway down the centre. So the ability to not cross somebody else's property is actually quite challenging. So typically what you'll find is if you're trying to service a Battleaxe, you may have to actually, put an underground service in order to service that Battleaxe property. So now I can see a ton of people have come online since I've started, so I'm just going to go back and say hello to a couple. So Cameron, George, Alex, Jobin, and Michael, plus a couple of others in there as well. So hi folks, how you going? I guess talking about site assessment due diligences in this stage. Now, I guess the next element that you want to consider is with regards to whether or not you're actually on a main road. Now, every single council will have a hierarchy of roads from, I guess, your suburban road, I guess, to an artery or an arterial road, and the like, and depending upon the hierarchy, they will have a care factor with regards to how much traffic comes on and off that property. And so the lower the hierarchy of the road, then I guess the easier it is for you to add an additional driveway. But if you're adding, I guess, higher in the hierarchy, so if it's a highway, for example, then typically the local jurisdiction won't want you to actually have an additional driveway actually coming on. Michael says, "Hi Rob, thanks for a great meetup. Sunil did a great job." Yes, he did. So for those who weren't there at our Sydney session, it was actually our first year anniversary in Sydney. We've been running 7 years in total for the Property Developer Network, but Sydney, that was our first anniversary, and I am slowly training up Sunil to take over the reins for me to be able to, I guess, run the show when I'm not in town. That way I can actually have a family life, and I'll try and balance that out by because at the moment I'm flying to Sydney, I'm flying to Melbourne, coming back to Brisbane. By the time I run those events every single weekend, I'm not spending much time at home. So Sunil has graciously taken on the Sydney event. I guess now looking for someone to similarly do the Melbourne event, and then I will be coming by every second month, for example, I guess, to keep that going. So yes, thank you Sunil, really appreciate that, and thank you Michael for the great thanks. Rado says, do you have all these Sunday sessions saved so we can watch them later as well? So the answer is yes, we do, Ray. Have them saved in a couple of different places. So firstly, it's actually on our Property Developer Network page, and secondly, I actually have a YouTube channel. So if you actually go onto YouTube and search for Property Developer Network, please like and subscribe. That would be greatly appreciated. All of the Facebook Lives are recorded there, the Sunday sessions. We also transcribe them so you can actually watch them without sound, which I know can be challenging in some instances as well. We can't transcribe them live, unfortunately, so hopefully you can find them there, Ray. Now, I was talking about road hierarchies, so let me finish that little segue. So road hierarchies may have some issues and challenges, not only with regards to can you add an additional driveway, but also how and what you can do with regards to where you're going to put your rubbish collection, for example. So if it's on a main road, then chances are they're not wanting you to put your wheelie bins out on the curb in peak hour traffic and that sort of thing. It can actually be quite challenging and troublesome. So in many instances, the main road is actually not a council jurisdiction, but it's actually a state government jurisdiction. And so when you work out what your road hierarchy is, it's whether or not you actually have to report into council or whether or not you have to report into the state government and seek their approval. Your town planner is going to give you plenty of guidance in regard to how to do that, but I guess make sure that that's quite important. The other thing with regards to access and driveways and the like is how far you are away from a corner. Now, everyone, I guess, has the perception that they want to have the corner block because it's so easy to subdivide. The challenge is if you're too close to a corner, you may not be legally allowed to put an additional driveway in because there's not enough room safety-wise for people to have visibility on and off the property. Excuse me. And equally, you may not have, I guess, the ability for others to I guess, not hit you as they're approaching that intersection. And depending upon, I guess, the significance of that intersection, whether or not it's a T intersection, whether or not it's a crossover, whether or not it's a traffic lights or a roundabout, that sort of thing, the distance from the corner will actually change significantly. So you want to make sure that you understand that road hierarchy and understand the distance that you are from the corner in that regard. Very, very important. If you can't avoid those, excuse me, if you can't avoid those, then what you may be able to do is have a shared driveway, and so that's something that you would need to actually negotiate with your council and or the state government if it's a main road. So it's not an additional driveway access, so you can say, well, it's a no worsening effect from that perspective, but you may be able to say, well, we've just got a little bit more traffic, so get a traffic engineer to actually monitor how much traffic's going past, what are the hours are that traffic actually occurs, and whether or not you're going to be adding any additional load into that area. So Just got a little bit of tickle in the throat, folks, so just going to soothe the tonsils. Some other elements that you want to do from a site assessment and due diligence is have a look at the contours that you've got on the property and determine how and where your property is sloping. I guess the common myth is that you want to be sloping towards the road, and that's always a fantastic outcome if you get it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the site is dead if it's not. It means that things are going to be a lot easier for you, because typically all the services that you need with regards to a lawful point of discharge for your stormwater, access for into your sewer connection and access to your water, that's going to be quite easy because gravity goes downhill, and I guess you've heard the expression, shit doesn't go uphill. So if you can push downhill, I guess, into that street scape, that's fantastic. But if you're sloping away from the road, that doesn't mean the site is not developable. What it means is you're going to have to do some searches to actually determine, I guess, where all those connecting services are, so where the stormwater is located, where your sewer is located, etc. And if you're in luck, those services are actually going to be located inside your property. So we'll deal with sewer and stormwater slightly different, but the implications are very similar in either case. But if they are inside your property, then you should be able to access them as if they were, I guess, on the road. So no issues or challenges in that regard. However, if they're not inside your property, then you may need to negotiate with your neighbours in order to actually get access to that. Now, I guess want to be very, very clear that you do not have an as of right to access any services connected into another neighbour's yard. Now, there's a misconception that there may be an easement over the service, and so that allows you access to plug into that. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The easement is in favour of the utility provider and not in favour of you, and so you need to negotiate with your neighbour to actually say, hey, Mr. Neighbour, can I please dig up your yard? And generally, if you're very, very lucky, they'll allow you access without too much drama. If you're not so lucky, they may actually refuse access. And so it's quite important that you actually negotiate that up front and determine how and what that is and how and where to access that. Now, depending upon your jurisdiction, when you, I guess, connect to that service, it may or may not enforce an easement over their property. So in most of New South Wales, it will actually enforce an easement so if you're doing stormwater access into the rear neighbour's yard, it will actually enforce an easement over their property, which means that you may have to pay a little bit of moolah to encourage the rear neighbour to allow you that access, because you're now encumbering their property forever and a day. So you need to make sure that you actually budget for that. So it's not just the cost of installing the service, but also the cost for creating the easement, and also the cost to reinstate the property, and I guess some bribery money to encourage them to actually allow you to do that. Now, in a worst case scenario, you don't have just the one neighbour to deal with, but you may have to access the services through multiple properties. And so you want to make sure you've got that very clear and identified up front. I'm aware of a number of people that have been caught unstuck and bought a property thinking that it was developable, only to find that they had to go through 4 or 5 properties in order to get their services out. And they got approval from 3 or 4 neighbours, but they didn't get the approval from the 5th one, and so all of a sudden their site is dead. Or if it's not dead, then the 5th person has a hell of a lot of leverage with regards to how much they're going to encourage you to fund them for the process. Now, typically you're going to have to pay for reinstating their property, so, you know, putting lawn back, putting garden beds back, putting fences back, and that sort of thing. But it's really the liquid cash that you need to deal with. So make sure in your due diligence process that you are actually capturing all of that and getting in writing whether or not that is actually the case. Now, in some jurisdictions, and not all, if you get in writing the fact that you cannot get a lawful point of discharge, the lawful point of discharge is for your stormwater. If you can't get that through a rear neighbour, you may be able to be entitled to an alternate solution, which may be, for example, a pumping solution or something along those lines. Now, not every single council will allow that, so please be careful that you assume that that's the case. I'm going to say the majority of councils won't allow that, but there are the occasional one that will. And the other solution is what they call a charged line. So a charged line means that I guess there is always water in the line, but you're hoping that the height of the roof, when water falls down, it actually pushes so imagine this is your roof, water comes down the line, across, and then up into the curb like that. So between these 2 points, any water above this will then spill out over here. So that's kind of how that works. You've seen that when you're siphoning petrol, or if you've seen a clear hose with water in it, you lift one end and the water stays balanced. Well, now imagine if you top water into the top, the other one's going to spill out over the side. So that's what a charged line is. Most councils don't like charged lines, and that's because when there is no rain actually occurring, there's always water sitting in the bottom of the line, which then becomes stagnant water, which attracts things like mosquitoes, attracts frogs, that sort of thing. Frogs take up home in the water, and all of a sudden frog dies in there. Now the charge line is blocked. Now the house floods. So a lot of councils don't actually like a charge line. So make sure you've checked out your particular jurisdiction as to what is allowed. Make sure you've checked access to your rear neighbour to make sure that they've actually allowed that access, and if they haven't, make sure you get in writing that they haven't, so that if there is any potential for an alternate solution, that you actually have that in place. So mindful of the fact that I haven't seen any questions come through, so I'm going to ask anybody, I guess, if they've got any questions to type them in here. There's always a bit of a lag between you guys writing a question and me seeing it, so very much looking for some questions that I can actually answer in regards to this as we go. So I can see a couple of others coming on, so Tanya, Dean and Martius, so welcome folks. It's starting to get a little bit chilly now that the sun's gone down here, so this beautiful rooftop garden has a nice little breeze coming in off the harbour, and it's just putting a little bit of a chill in my spine. Any questions coming through, folks, at all? Some other elements for due diligence are going to come down to strategy specific. So strategy specific, whether you're building a house, whether you're building a townhouse, etc., you want to make sure that you've actually got the side and rear setbacks actually already known and defined for your local council, so that you know whether or not you've actually got room in order to create a building envelope on your property. Now, many councils actually mandate you must have a minimum building envelope to legally be able to subdivide, for example. So if you've got a side setback of 1 metre and a rear setback of 6 metres, then effectively you've got this side with 1 metre, this side with 1 metre, and the rear with 6 metres, and you may have a front setback of 6 metres as well. That kind of leaves a small rectangle in the middle that may not necessarily be large enough to actually have a building pad. So many councils mandate that you have a minimum building pad rectangle size, so be careful of that. And the reason why they do that is because sometimes when you're actually subdividing, you don't get a normal regular shaped block. You may get a triangular block, especially if you're on at the end of a cul-de-sac or something along those lines, and they want to make sure that there's actually a building pad envelope that is actually large enough to take a reasonable house or a reasonable property. Now, every council deals with this a little bit differently. Some councils have what is called a regular block, and then also a small lot, and so the side setbacks for each of those may be slightly different, and generally they're a little bit more generous with regards to not enforcing larger setbacks on the small lots, because they know it's much harder to get that actual building envelope. So make sure that you've actually done that. And if you're building townhouses, then those setbacks become even more critical, and generally they'll be a staggered setback, because as you go up in stories, they want to make sure that the property is not actually casting a shadow over the neighbouring property, and equally they want to make sure that there's enough sunlight coming in to the upper levels. So you may have, for example, a 1 metre setback on ground floor, it might be a 1.5 metre setback on the second floor, and it might be a 2 metre setback on the third floor. So every council does that slightly differently, so make sure that you check with your local jurisdiction as to how that's played out. The other elements, and these are pretty obvious, but you want to make sure that you're checking what other constraints are actually sitting and applying on your site. So your zoning is your maximum potential for the site, and yet there are a number of other elements that sit over the top of the zoning that then become constraints to see whether or not you're actually ever going to achieve that potential. So some of those include overlays. So those overlays may be things like, have you got significant trees? Is there some heritage protection? Those elements tend to come into play. Is there any overland flow? Is there any flood, inundation, those sorts of things? So now one of the common questions that I get is, what's the difference between a flood, overland flow, and stormwater? So I might just use this opportunity to touch on that. So flooding typically comes from the breaking of the banks of either a creek, river, or subsidiary, which means that the creek has actually been inundated with a whole bunch of water. But how did the water get there? And that's probably the I guess the critical question, and that's where overland flow comes into place. So overland flow is when water comes from the sky and hits the ground. A lot of it gets absorbed by the earth itself, and so it doesn't instantly turn into runoff. But when the ground is actually saturated and it can't absorb any more water, then water tends to flow over the top of the ground in what is called overland flow, and it follows the contours of the land and snakes its way towards those creeks and subsidiaries. And so depending upon the amount of rain and the duration of that rain, whether or not there is any overland flow at all can come into play. But once that ground is saturated and the overland flow comes into place, then it's understanding what is the path that overland flow is going to take in order to get to the creek or subsidiary, and the speed that it's going, so the velocity, and also the depth. So they're quite important in the process. So if you have any overland flow at all on your property, then you want to make sure that you engage a hydraulics engineer to do a study to see how big is the catchment, how likely is it that the overland flow is actually going to occur, and then what is the speed, the depth, and the velocity of that overland flow. And depending upon your council, they may have some rules with regards to what is the minimum habitable height that you need to have for your property over and above that, I guess, that maximum depth of the water. Now, in doing that, you want to make sure that you are not impacting on any neighbours. So if you're going to put a great big concrete slab and just redirect the water around your property, then that chances are that's going to impact your neighbours. So most councils are not happy with doing that. So make sure that you are very clear with that. Now, stormwater is slightly different. So stormwater is the fact that, well, now there is no earth to absorb the water because we've put a dwelling there with a hard corrugated iron roof or tiled roof, that sort of thing, and so when the rain comes down, it no longer gets absorbed into the ground, and instead it just hits this hard surface, I guess flows into your gutters, and then comes out as a torrent. And so being able to deal with that is quite important, and so that is called a lawful point of discharge in how you actually, or an LPOD in how you actually get rid of that. So one of the things to make sure is if you do not have an LPOD, then you cannot subdivide, you cannot do your townhouses, you can't do units, that sort of thing. You need to have a legal way of actually getting that velocity of water off your property. So hopefully that explains some of those elements. But there are other overlays to be cognizant of, whether there's any heritage protection, whether there's there's different ages for properties that we'll care about. There might be some cultural significance to a property, those sorts of things. Now every council is actually going to deal with that in a slightly different way. there might be some significant trees on your property that council have deemed to be protected. Now, some councils will actually notify that via an overlay. Other councils won't notify it via an overlay. Instead, you have to physically call the council and get them to clarify that. And other councils, again, force you to actually apply for the removal of every tree. So don't just assume that, just because it's a non-native tree that you can actually remove that. In many instances, council will actually care about that. If you're actually backing onto a creek, a river, or some other tributary, then there's also, I guess, generally a barrier or an area that follows that creek that protects flora, fauna, and vegetation in and around that creek, so that any habitable species that are, I guess, thriving off of that little ecosystem are actually protected. So you may have a clear access to your creek, for example, and council will say, well, that's great, there's no trees there right now, but we actually want there to be some flora, fauna, and vegetation. So they may actually say you need to either A, reinstate it, or B, alternatively, that you can't build any structures there. So you can't put a pool there, you can't put a granny flat, those sorts of things. Question from Michael: I know all councils are different, but are there any way around flood zones and fire buffers for doing Battleaxe subs or townhouses? I guess you've touched on it there, Michael. That I guess there's every single council is actually going to deal with that slightly differently. So the flood zones are defined very differently in every single council. Some councils have a clearly defined flood map that is articulated and visible via your overlays. Other councils don't, and actually mandate that you actually have to do that flood study yourself and determine whether or not that actually has an impact. Some of them then have rules with regards to how high above minimum habitable height you can actually go, whereas others don't have that at all. Other councils will determine if the entire frontage of your property has overland flow over the front of it. They won't allow you to subdivide, because what they're concerned about is that at some point in the future, if there is some level of flooding in the area, if they need to get emergency services like an ambulance or paramedics, that sort of thing there, that they can't actually access your property. So every council is actually going to deal with that differently. Now, bushfire, however, is slightly different. So bushfire, whilst the overlay is captured by the council, generally it actually triggers the NCC, the National Construction Code, what used to be called the Building Codes of Australia. It actually triggers those codes to say how and what level of fire rating do you actually need to be able to build to. So the council will capture, I guess, the likelihood of that fire event and also the impact of that. But as soon as it triggers it, then it goes to the NCC to determine how you actually are going to resolve that. Now, depending upon the level of fire retardation that you need to worry about, if it's, I guess, a very light zone, what they're caring about is that embers that might be on a fire maybe 100 metres away that might float in the air. They want to make sure that those embers don't get caught in any nooks or crannies or that sort of thing in your gutters, and that there's nothing that's going to collect in your gutters with regards to dry leaves, etc., to actually trigger those. And if you're very close, then they may go through to saying, well, you actually need to have fireproof walls and windows and those sorts of things. So can actually add significant cost to your construction. Generally it doesn't stop generally it doesn't actually stop it per se, but it actually significantly increases the cost to construct. That said, if you're doing townhouses, it may impact the density that you can actually do on townhouses, but generally doesn't impact a subdivision per se. So hopefully that answers your question, Michael, and the like. Just noting time, so we're tracking pretty well. Has anyone else got any questions, folks? I guess very keen to hear from you guys as to some of the elements that you're wanting to know about from your due diligence perspective. while we wait for those to come in, trying to think what I've already covered. So I've already covered side setbacks, building heights. You want to understand what your building heights are. Your building heights generally are in reference to what is called natural ground. Now, natural ground is different to the current height of the property right now, and that may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but natural ground is as it was originally way back in the day. Quite often, as properties are developed over time, we tend to get earth movers in, and we need to, we push things around, we put retaining walls up, we put pools in, all those sorts of things which change the current levels to what is the original natural ground levels. So most of the time you're going to be building to what is called natural ground. Now, why is that important? Because when you're actually getting a survey done, it's important that you actually ask for both the current contours, because that's what's going to be important with regards to what your architect's going to be drawing on. It's going to be important with regards to what your civil engineer is going to be doing from an LPOD and a sewer connection point of view. But additionally, you want to know the natural ground, because the architect needs to know, or how far above natural ground can I actually go. Now, a sneaky little trick for some councils, and not all, is that if you have an approved retaining wall, then the approved retaining wall becomes the new natural ground. So a lot of the councils will say if the retaining wall is below a certain height, then you don't actually need to have an approval. But if it's above that height, that you may need to get an operational works approval for that to be put in place. But once they have approved it, that becomes the new natural ground. And so a sneaky little thing that I've seen done in the past on a slopey site, there was potential for some views on this property that I saw with a slopey site, but they couldn't quite get it on the current natural ground. So what they did is they got an approval for a retaining wall and put an above ground pool onto the property, and because it was above ground, the retaining wall had to go, I guess, towards the above ground pool. They went and constructed that above ground pool, and then that became the new natural ground. And then based on that new natural ground, they were then able to go up another metre or two, which enabled them to get those beautiful city views. So I've seen it done. I'm not going to say that it works in every single council, but just know that that little sneaky tip or trick is one that might be one that you want to keep in your little kit bag for the future. So I can see a couple other people come on. So I can see Bharat and Georgiana as well. So hi folks, how you going? We're just talking about site assessment due diligence processes. Now I did have a list that I was going to go through, and I just need to rattle my brain as to where I'm at in the process to see if I've covered them all. But while I'm rattling my brain, why don't you guys, I guess, throw some questions out and see what I can cover and help you out in that regard. So just finishing off that building height perspective, typically your council is actually going to dictate what that building height is. Sometimes they'll say it's limited to 2 stories, sometimes they'll say it's 8.5 metres, sometimes they'll say it's 9.5 metres. Every single council is actually going to deal with that differently, and they may actually deal with that slightly differently in different parts of the city. So, and for example, if you're in a hilly area, they may say that the heights are going to potentially impact the views of surrounding neighbours, so they may be quite constrictive in regards to that. Generally they'll say a number of stories, but not a number of levels. So it's possible if you're on imagine you've got a hill that goes up like this. If you put 2 stories here and then go back across, then right here this is only on 1 story because it's further up the hill. So you could actually add another story there. So that's 1, 2 stories here, go across, 1, 2 stories here. So it's actually 3 levels, 1, 2, 3, but only 2 stories at any one point in time. So you want to be cognizant of the fact that that may actually may be possible in some areas, but it's the roof height that they generally are going to care about. Michael says, I know you have to take into consideration overshadowing other properties, but do you have to consider in your designs neighbouring properties affecting your development as well? The answer is you do, but not as directly as what you might think, Michael. Generally, it's going to come down to the fact that they already have some windows in place. And so when you design your property, you want to make sure that any windows that you have are not directly opposite their windows, so that there's no line of sight in between the two properties. And if you are forced to put windows directly opposite each other, then you may have to put some privacy screens or something like that up in place to actually have that. So it's not a shadowing element, but it's more a privacy element in that regard. So hopefully that answers your question. Alex has got a question regarding building heights. If only given a height in metres, i.e. not a number of stories, what do you allow per story to work out how many stories you can build? E.g. if 27 metres, how many stories? I've seen some divide by 3 metres, another divide by 3.3 per story. So it's a good question, Alex. It really comes down to I guess you've got a legal building height, which is your absolute minimum that you can actually go. And for someone like me, I'm 187 centimetres tall. If I walk into a property that is only just barely legal height, then I feel like I'm actually going to bump into lights and bump into fans and things like that. So that's the minimum requirement. And so if you keep to that minimum requirement, and I think off the top of my head, that's 2.1 metres. But then the next story is then going to have, I guess, a little bit of floor. So there's the ceiling here and then the floor here, and there's I guess the joists and that sort of thing that go in the middle, and that's where you're going to run your plumbing and your electricals and all that sort of thing. So generally you're going to need a minimum of 300 mils just to do that. So if you're wanting to be, I guess, really skimpy on your height, ceiling height, then you can, I guess, go minimum habitable height. But generally, if you're going for a level of opulence, then you want to open that up. So, you know, if you've got a 2.7 metre height, that's actually quite a nice, you know, spacious feel. And then you've got the 30 centimetres on top of that, which then gives you, I guess the layers in between the two floors. And if you want extravagance, that's where you go for the 3.3. So if you are not limited to and so where it becomes a balance is you've got a maximum building height and you've also got a maximum number of stories, and so you say, well, maybe depending upon the circumstance, I might go lower height on one level in order to I guess get the maximum on the next level where the opulence is actually required. Or you might do it the other way around. I might do a maximum height on the bottom level because I want to push that top floor up a little bit more so it actually gets the views. Your architect's going to come into play very much there in regards to that, to try and work out what is the best way to actually maximise I guess the design of that particular property. So hopefully that actually helps. So we're coming up to the 45-minute mark, folks, and only those couple of questions that have come in. I'm trying to think of the other elements that I wanted to cover in the due diligence, but I think most of it's come out already. It's really that. It's really. Oh, sorry, there is one. So I said zoning is your maximum potential, and then the other constraints that will actually apply. So you've got your overlays specifically, then you've got your contours, etc. You've also got things like your street frontage, the width of the property. So if it's not wide enough, maybe you can't actually maybe you can't do what you need to do with regards to getting access to the rear of the property, or you can't build the width of the property. So the width of the property is actually quite important. And the other one that I had just pop into my head that's quite important is it's just fallen out, so it'll come back to me. In the meantime, I can see a question from Barat. We have a DA application for 6 units in an R3 zone, meets all requirements, but council wants / forcing us to buy next neighbouring lot. Can they do that? I guess without seeing your specific site, Barat, I can't really talk to it in any depth. But generally, what they'll do is they may have a minimum density requirement, and so if you're trying to do units in particular, they may mandate that if you're trying to get a certain density or yield out of the site, that you need to acquire multiple properties so that you don't have these big skinny towers going straight up and then a gap and then another skinny tower. What they want to do instead because otherwise what happens is you get overshadowing over the next two properties. Instead, they want to have a large gap and then a big square shape unit complex, and so I think that's what they're probably trying to do here. And typically what they'll do is they'll say you need to have a minimum lot size in order to get the yield that you're after. And so I've seen in many instances say if you've got a certain lot size you can have a certain yield, and if you've got a larger lot size you can get a bigger yield. I've seen that play out as significantly as high density, where you're allowed, say 15 stories. If you've got a smaller lot, they'll say, well, you can only go to 4 stories. When you've got a larger lot, they'll say, well, now you can go to 8. When you've got a larger lot again, they'll say 12. And when you've got a larger lot again, they'll say 15. So I'm going to say it's probably something along those lines, Barat, as to how and what they're trying to do there. But without actually seeing, I guess, the site specifically, I can't do that. But your town planner should be the one guiding you very much as to whether or not that is, excuse me, whether or not that's actually in play. But having said that, that's a great segue to the element that fell out of my head before, and that is the fact that council will often have, they have different names for this in every single jurisdiction, but it might be called a neighbourhood plan, it might be called an LEP, lots of things like that, or a neighbourhood character, depending upon the state or council that you're in, and it's basically council trying to be very prescriptive as to what they want to get out of a little neighbourhood or a little section of the neighbourhood, and sometimes that will be very prescriptive all the way down to the individual site itself. And so it's not just the zoning, it's not just the overlays, but it's also, I guess, that neighbourhood plan, LEP/neighbourhood character that you need to actually be cognizant of. So, and I'm going to suspect in your instance, Barat, that something along those lines has actually come into play, but without seeing that, it's hard to tell. That said, folks, it's coming up to the hour, so I'm going to, I guess, call quits to this one. I guess a reminder that the next meetup is in Melbourne. For anyone that's there, that's on the 5th of October. That's going to be run by my good friend Tony Meredith. Next event after that is actually the start of our property development formula program, which is the 11th, 12th and 13th of October. So if anyone is actually interested in our 12-month program, please feel free to reach out until then. But otherwise, folks, I look forward to chatting to you next Sunday for our next Sunday session. So bye for now. Bye. Beer o'clock.